Welcome, everyone, to the Disruption Drives podcast. I'm Hari Sripati, also known as the Mad Hatter. I have a very special guest with me tonight. As we all know, the autonomous vehicle revolution is at an inflection point in 2025. Here in America, at least 10 cities are likely to be seeing robo-taxis by the end of this year. We also face a lot of headwinds and tailwinds of a new administration, which, among other things, has started to promise easing of certain regulations and, of course, changing of several others. And I cannot find a better person to talk to about this than Adam Raviv. Now, Adam was formerly chief counsel at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is the chief federal regulator of the U.S. auto industry and transport. He currently leads the automotive and mobility practice at a very prestigious law firm, Sidley Austin, where he advises clients on navigating legislation and enforcement of rules that govern all of automotive transport. Now, he's got a fabulous background, but I'll let him talk to that more. But Adam, thank you for joining us, and I want to start with asking you, look, you're a Harvard-trained lawyer, Harvard Law School, uh, and you've at this point worked in politics, the highest echelons. You've worked in academia, you've worked in corporate as well. So walk us through that journey, and why did you pick transport of all things?
First, thank you very much, Harry, for having me on. It's a real pleasure to speak to you today. And I can give you a little bit of my background. After finishing college, grad school, law school, I worked at a private practice here in Washington, D.C. Another large law firm for a number of years, where I did a variety of different types of litigation, international arbitration, different types of regulatory work. And then I was fortunate to have the opportunity to join the Biden-Harris administration on day one. My first day there was January 20th of 2021. My first job in the administration was in the White House in the vetting office, where I focused on issues of financial disclosure, conflicts of interest, and ethics generally, making sure that the nominees for the administration, and I dealt with many hundreds of nominees, would play by the rules and do what they needed to in order to do the jobs they were being considered for with the utmost integrity. So I had that role for quite a while, and then I moved to the Department of Justice, which was a different place and a different role. In the Department of Justice, I worked in the leadership office of the Civil Division. So the Civil Division at DOJ is the largest litigating component in the entire department. It does a very broad range of work on all kinds of matters. And as a member of the front office of the Civil Division, I handled a pretty broad portfolio of mainly litigation work involving all kinds of cases, ranging from cases involving social media companies to cases involving pharma companies, policy questions, criminal matters. I also did a lot of work and worked on some very contentious litigation arising out of immigration matters. I also tended to, as a general matter, tended to work on cases that seemed to have DOJ's leadership very concerned, either because they were very high profile, they were very high sensitive, they were very high stakes, because those are the kinds of cases that would get the attention of the leadership office of the Civil Division. I mean, the Civil Division has over 1,000 lawyers working on who many knows how many thousands of cases. Only a real subset of those would tend to require the close attention of the leadership of the department, and I tended to get thrown on those kinds of cases. And then, after working at DOJ for a while, I had the very exciting opportunity to move on to a real leadership role in the Department of Transportation. And as you said, Harry, I specifically worked at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA. I will try to keep
NHTSA.
Abbreviations during this podcast to a minimum.
That's the word we will use. Yes, NHTSA is reasonable. I think National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is a mouthful, but NHTSA, absolutely. So you were the chief counsel at NHTSA, yes.
Exactly. So NHTSA is one of the operating administrations of the U.S. Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation is, for the most part, divided up into different agencies or operating administrations, each one of which deals with a different mode of transportation. So those of us in the know within the department would call the different operating administrations the different modes. So NHTSA is essentially the car mode of the Department of Transportation. Other components include the biggest and best known mode or component within the Department of Transportation is the FAA, which of course deals with aviation. And then you've also got, for example, the Federal Railroad Administration that deals with railroads. You've got the Maritime Administration that deals with everything on the sea. And you've got several others. So NHTSA focuses on vehicle safety, driving safety, and fuel economy. Those, broadly speaking, are probably the three main charges that it has. This being government and government being complicated, NHTSA does some other things too. And as chief counsel, I was really heavily involved in a lot of the policy decision making, the enforcement actions, and the rulemaking that the agency did. And it was a real privilege to take on a role like that. And as you can probably gather, it was very different from the jobs that I had had both in government previously and out of government. So
Yeah,
it was a really exciting opportunity. And what I really benefited from was the immense expertise and also the immense patience of the many other great professionals that I worked with at NHTSA and the Department of Transportation,
absolutely.
who were really terrific in answering all my questions, helping me understand what I needed to understand in order to help guide the agency and help the agency make decisions. So as chief counsel, I led the legal department within the agency. And I mean, the legal department is always an important component of any agency or just about any organization. And at an agency like NHTSA that does a lot of regulatory and enforcement work, it's really central to what the agency does in just about every respect. And uh, in addition to being chief counsel and heading the legal department, I was the second ranking official within the agency as a whole. I reported directly to the deputy administrator of the agency, who at the time was acting as the administrator of the agency. Um, and then, of course, ultimately, we were under the larger umbrella of the Department of Transportation, which was headed by Secretary Pete
Yeah,
and a really fantastic leadership team that I dealt with and worked with very frequently as well.
absolutely. Well, Secretary Pete is formerly Mayor Pete, maybe at least presidential candidate Pete, at least seems like, is a former consultant like we are, right? So that's a style that I'm assuming you had to get used to. But let me ask you a little bit. You've obviously worked on, this, both from your background as a civil litigator across, social challenges and then transport as a whole. Let me ask you this: how much do you track the history of automotive regulation? And especially the question is, where are we today, considering the innovations, considering the technological sort of cycles that have been going on? What is the mandate today of any administration?
Sure. Yeah. So stepping back, as you alluded to, one of the key responsibilities of NHTSA is, by statute, is to issue the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, or one more abbreviation, the FMVSS. The Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards are the literal rules of the road. When a motor vehicle or a piece of motor vehicle equipment operates on public roads in the United States, in order to have the legal right to do that, it has to comply with all of the federal motor vehicle safety standards that apply to it. So there are FMVSS that apply to passenger cars. There are FMVSS that apply to light trucks, medium-sized trucks, heavy trucks, motorcycles, and all kinds of equipment. And there's really several dozen federal motor vehicle safety standards, some of which have many subparts. And they range in everything from dealing with the effectiveness of braking systems to headlights to dashboard displays to the glass that is on windows in vehicles. And they broadly can be divided up really into sort of three categories. First, you have crash worthiness standards. So if a vehicle gets into a crash, these standards aim to minimize how bad the crash is for the occupants of the vehicle, or potentially in some cases for people outside the vehicle. So things like seatbelt requirements, airbags, those would be crash worthiness standards. And then you have crash avoidance standards, which are performance standards and equipment standards designed to help prevent crashes from happening at all when possible. So this,
Driver assist.
yeah, so the effectiveness of your braking system, that would be a crash avoidance standard. And then the third standard, there aren't quite as many of these rules, deal with essentially post-crash conditions. So they're sort of designed to protect the integrity of systems so that things don't get worse than they need to, specifically to be more specific to prevent fires.
Right.
For the most part, from engines, uh, electric vehicle batteries, and things like that. So, those are, broadly speaking, the federal motor vehicle safety standards. They've been developed over a period of decades. And whenever NHTSA issues a federal motor vehicle standard, it does not have the right to simply publish it one day and say, here's the rule. Rather, under federal law, as with most other types of regulations that are issued under federal law, there is a specific and somewhat detailed procedure that NHTSA needs to follow. And the key part of it is that normally, well, for any FMVSS or for other rulemakings that NHTSA does, NHTSA will first publish a proposed rule, a proposed FMVSS, and then it will solicit comments from members of the public. So typically, whenever there's a proposed FMVSS or a proposed change to an existing FMVSS, you'll have OEMs, equipment manufacturers, advocacy groups, international standard setting organizations, safety organizations, individual members of the public who have concerns. They will provide public comments on what's called a docket. And NHTSA is essentially required to take those comments into consideration and certainly review them. And then as it does that, and as it does whatever other analysis it needs to do, then the agency will put in the work to come up with a finalized version of the rule. It might be identical to the previous rule. More likely, it will be somewhat different from the initial proposal. And NHTSA, and sorry, I'll let you talk in just a second. NHTSA will address all the comments that it receives in its final rulemaking.
I want to sharpen the pencil, and of course, this is a great overview of basically automotive vehicle safety standards as regulated by NHTSA. But
Yeah.
with basically the onset of software-defined vehicles, which are what autonomous, which is one of the big changes going on in disruptions in the automotive industry. Now, how does this mandate now change? Or does it become harder and more difficult? Because we're going to start seeing cars without driver seats at all.
Yeah, yeah.
And then
So
software, it's all software defined environment, brake by wire, drive by wire, those are, yeah.
yeah, it's a great question, Howard. It's also a big question. So one, I think, fairly common misconception that I heard it when I was in government, and I sometimes still hear it, is what autonomous vehicle companies need to do in order to get permission to put their vehicles on the road. And that's actually not the right way to frame it at the federal level. If a vehicle is compliant with the federal motor vehicle safety standards that apply to the type of vehicle that it is, then the standards, for the most part, are neutral about whether the vehicle is driven by a human or driven by a computer. And the upshot of that is that if you take a vehicle off the assembly line produced by an OEM that has all the fully compliant equipment and characteristics of a vehicle that's driven by a person, if you then put a whole bunch of tech on it, put sensors on, put decision-making algorithms on, put vehicle control mechanisms on, so that the vehicle can drive and navigate and do everything an autonomous level 4 or maybe one day level 5 vehicle needs to do. Then on the federal level, it is 100% legal to put that vehicle on the road without any additional permissions from federal regulators. And that is how some autonomous vehicle companies operate. Their vehicles are fully compliant with the existing FMVSS. They just have additional added capabilities that allow the vehicle to drive itself. And there are no specific rules that only apply or additional requirements that companies need to fulfill if they
Got
are
it.
if they have autonomous capabilities.
But then all the autonomous deployments are, of course, happening at the city and state level.
Yeah.
And so, talk me a little bit, again, this may come to your background, and with Sidley, you deal with a lot of these challenges as well. Uh, and so, yeah, so can you compare the broad sort of legislative mandates that are in place in types of, let's call it suburban versus metro versus maybe rural? And
Yeah.
so where are we going to see those inflection points? I mean, I know New York City, I live here, and it's probably one of the most complicated places to launch, but I mean, Waymo has decided to launch in a couple of years.
So what I've talked about already, I've been careful to specify that uh, that the federal motor vehicle safety standards, they are the federal
They're the
standards.
federal,
Um,
absolutely, but I'm just wondering. Yeah,
state and local governments can and frequently do get involved in the regulation of autonomous vehicles. As of now, you don't have what is called preemption by federal law. There are some areas of federal law, including some areas even relating to auto safety, where the existence of a federal rule essentially means that states and local governments are not allowed to regulate in that area. The
can you
federal
explain
rule.
that? What do you mean by preemption? Sorry.
Sure, yeah. So preemption is a legal concept where the existence of a regulation or law at one level of government means that other levels of government are not allowed to
Got it.
regulate in that area.
Got it.
So, for example, if you have an express federal motor vehicle safety standard, that applies to headlight technology, then under federal law, state and local governments are not allowed to, pass their own separate and different headlight regulations.
I
And
see.
if they try to, then a company that is regulated could actually sue and would successfully sue to have a court hold that those state and local rules don't apply to it. But sorry, go ahead, Harry.
But you're saying for autonomous vehicles, there is no preemption. So states are free to sort of enact, states and cities are free to enact certain rules.
Yes. Yeah, that is correct. And that is precisely because there are no federal motor vehicle safety standards that really regulate that really regulate autonomous vehicles, as opposed to just the fact that the existing FMVSS, they regulate all vehicles and are essentially agnostic about whether they
Right.
about who's driving it. So yeah, because of that, you do have quite a bit of state regulation and quite a bit of local regulation of autonomous operations. And the one word that you constantly hear from people who want a uniform federal standard or who have problems with the fact that different jurisdictions do things differently is the word patchwork. It's a patchwork of very different rules that apply, and some places are generally more open to free autonomous operations than others. Some places you have to jump through hoops. Some places you don't have to jump through hoops, and some places they don't even give you a hoop to jump through. They just, in some respects, you just can't do it at all. So my understanding, you mentioned New York. My understanding is, as of now, the law essentially requires a driver to be behind the wheel of motor vehicles that operate in New York. That could well change, and there are discussions about whether to change it. But my understanding is that is what the law requires now, and the law is, and that makes it much more restrictive than a lot of
Right.
places.
Right.
Places where autonomous robotaxis or trucks or even transit vehicles are starting to operate and in some cases are really expanding dramatically. I guess on the other far end of the spectrum, you have Texas, for example. It's not the only state like this, but under current law, essentially, if a vehicle is complying with the FMVSS, then it is free to operate on public roads in Texas, regardless of whether it has a human driver or not. And in fact, Texas state law even prohibits local governments within the state, like city governments, from imposing additional restrictions on autonomous operations. It even prevents local governments within Texas from requiring like information about operations, let alone restricting those operations. So a lot of the data that city governments in Texas are able to gather is really just through voluntary submission by companies. They are the city governments don't have the ability to even mandate data disclosure about operations, let alone regulate those operations. And then I'll give just one other example because it's the biggest, the most populous state and the state that gets the most attention, and that's California. So California, as a general matter, it does allow autonomous operations, and I think there are probably more autonomous operations happening there than anywhere else. I was in Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, saw quite a few driverless vehicles on the road, robo-taxis. However, California does have an extensive permitting process. And a big part of that permitting process is that a vehicle needs to undergo very extensive, many thousands of miles of testing before it is allowed to operate without a driver, and then further before it's allowed to fully deploy. And that's for passenger vehicles, robo-taxis. The restrictions on trucking are even more severe. As of today, I believe California is the one state that outright prohibits autonomous trucking, although there is a proposal, a current proposal that I think, based on what I know, has a good chance of passing that will allow change the rules to allow autonomous trucking, heavy trucking within the state, but again, with only after a very, very large amount of test driving.
So as we stand today, and the way I, again, is following some of your blogs as well, AV companies have sort of two major routes for, basically adhering to NHTSA standards. So there's the Part 555 and the AV exemption process, AVEP. For a layman, could you contrast the two? What are the, I guess, pros and cons of either approach?
Sure. So
maybe that's the wrong, maybe a bad question to ask a lawyer.
No, I'll try to make it as understandable to our human listeners as we can. We've already talked about the federal motor vehicle safety standards. So those are normally the equipment and performance standards that a vehicle needs to conform to for it to operate legally on public roads in the United States at the federal level. Occasionally, a vehicle manufacturer will decide, I want to do something innovative, and I want to make a vehicle safe. At the same time, I want to make it safe in a way that doesn't fully comply with the existing federal motor vehicle safety standards. And in a case like that, the company can seek an exemption from certain federal motor vehicle safety standards. And this can happen in a variety of contexts, but it certainly can and does happen with respect to autonomous vehicles, because a lot of the FMVSS, they were drafted, although they weren't drafted to require a human driver. Many of them were drafted with the general assumption that there would be a human driver behind the wheel. I mean, many of these standards are decades old. And given that reality, some FMVSS might not be strictly necessary when a vehicle does not have a person behind the wheel. Some of the FMVSS were designed with the assumption that there would be a designated driver's seat, a steering wheel, manual braking and driving controls. And when it's a computer behind the wheel, those things may not be necessary. Um, NHTSA has engaged in one rulemaking back in 2022 to sort of tweak some of its existing FMVSS that dealt with crashworthiness to just sort of account for the possibility that a vehicle would not have a human driver. But that was not the creation of an FMVSS that really dealt with safety standards for autonomous vehicles. So in any event, you have some companies that are carefully designing vehicles, autonomous vehicles. They want them to be safe. They think they are safe, and they think they are at least as safe as fully compliant FMVSS. But once you get a human out of the driver's seat, then there is potential for innovation. To use a cliche, outside the box thinking, and you might have a creative type of vehicle that looks different. It has different equipment. Maybe doesn't have certain equipment. Maybe it doesn't need that equipment. And in a case like that, you can ask NHTSA for an exemption from certain federal motor vehicle safety standards. And now I'm getting to your real question about the different kinds of exemptions.
Yeah,
There are a few different regulations and statutes that provide for the possibility of exemption from federal motor vehicle safety standards. And it's a little bit complicated, but I'll try to distill it into sort of maybe two main types of exemptions that have gotten some attention recently because of certain policy announcements from the Department of Transportation and from NHTSA's current leadership. You have one type of exemption that for autonomous vehicles is given under a program that's called AVEP, A-V-E-P. And these types of exemptions are really given to vehicles that are not going to be operated commercially. They usually deal with things like prototypes or vehicles that are going to be used for research. And it's usually very small numbers of vehicles that are subject to like a given exemption. It's not, you would not really be able to seek this type of exemption if you're looking to deploy a fleet of robo-taxis or a fleet of autonomous trucks or autonomous delivery vehicles. These would really be maybe even closer to kind of one-offs. And it's a very useful exemption to get in order for testing to be done, for research to be done, for demonstrations of a particular vehicle's capability. But at the same time, the AVEP exceptions are really made for just
popular mechanics.
much more targeted use
Got it.
vehicles, not just vehicles that a regular person is going to buy or use to hail and as a ride share.
Makes sense.
So in the history of the exemption, there have only been a few hundred autonomous vehicles that have received exemptions under AVEP, under the AVEP program. I don't mean a few hundred vehicle models. I mean a few hundred vehicles. It's just
Right. Individual vehicles, you mean?
Yeah. So recently, NHTSA and DOT announced that they would start expanding the availability of that type of exemption to domestically produced vehicles. So for reasons that are essentially an accident of history, this particular exemption had largely been only made available to imported vehicles, and not really for any specific policy reasons, but just because of things having to do with the kind of the legislative history of the statute that gave rise to the exemption, not out of a specific effort to like favor imported vehicles over domestic vehicles. But in any event, NHTSA announced that it was going to start making this kind of exemption available to domestically produced vehicles. But again, it's just going to be this very limited number of prototype and demonstration vehicles.
Got it. And the NHTSA regulations are for, of course, larger fleets as you scale and so on.
Yeah, and that brings me to the other type of exemption that I'm going to get to. And yeah, so you have this other exemption granted under a statutory, or rather under a regulatory provision that is known as the 555 exemption, and that type of exemption is available to larger numbers of vehicles and available to vehicles that can be either sold or used commercially. And So this type of exemption kind of allows you to do more if you get it. The downside, the reason why everyone doesn't just try to get this exemption is because strictly because pretty much exactly because it's available for larger numbers of vehicles and commercially operated vehicles. The process to get an exemption is somewhat long, can be somewhat longer, more involved. NHTSA really drills down with the company to work with them because under the relevant statute, the company that is seeking an exemption under Section 555 needs to show that it provides a equivalent level of safety as a fully compliant vehicle would. And that's a responsibility that NHTSA takes very seriously. And when a company is seeking an exemption under Section 555, then it works with NHTSA. Now there's a specific office at NHTSA that deals specifically with working with companies that are seeking exemptions. But so I mentioned earlier the public notice and comment period that apply to NHTSA rulemaking and to most agency rulemaking throughout the federal government. Well, you also have a required notice and comment period for companies that are seeking Section 555 exemptions.
Got it.
So it is not and not designed to be a closed door process. So members of the public can comment, and if there are members of the public who think a certain vehicle makes them nervous or they have reason to believe, either due to their own technical expertise or just due to their own opinion that an exemption shouldn't be granted, then a member of the public can comment on that. A competitor of a company can comment on an exemption that's being sought. So as of today, only one autonomous vehicle company has received a 555 exemption. Some other applications have been pending, and you occasionally get an application that is submitted and then eventually withdrawn.
Interesting. So let me sort of that's been a great lesson in just the regulations for the autonomous vehicle and automotive industry overall. Let me ask you a sort of maybe a crystal ballish question, but the new administration has of course come in and you've critiqued this in the past, but they've definitely taken a look at the 555 mandates and said where they were going to expedite some of these the approval processes. But in your just reading of it, and not to have you give a legal argument one against the other. How does this necessarily tilt the scale? Is it advantage to startups or advantage to incumbents in terms of the onerous, right, or the cost of launching or the entry costs into this industry, because it's a very nascent technology.
Yeah. I mean, every big regulatory burden, and this is a universal across government, tends to favor incumbents because it's that much harder to do something different, and B, navigating that burdensome process is easier for companies and organizations that have significant resources.
Right.
So that can include big OEMs, or big suppliers. It can also potentially include, though, companies that are backed, startup type companies that might be backed by much larger tech interests or backed by VCs who have considerable resources and are willing to put it behind them.
The bigger you are, at this point, of course, it's become easier in this industry, especially because scale is so critical.
Yeah. I mean, NHTSA, I will tell you, NHTSA does not try to make things deliberately difficult, but people within the agency, they take their statutory mandate seriously to certainly understand.
All government.
Yeah, to certainly understand whether a vehicle meets the equivalent level of safety. And as you alluded, there have been announcements recently that there was going to be an effort to speed up the 555 exemption process. I think.
I guess that's the question, because is it essentially going to mean there's going to be many more players in this field entering this? Because I mean, you've seen companies during the electrification sort of curve. A lot of companies took advantage of certain regulatory windows to launch, and that.
Yeah. I mean, an important thing to keep in mind is that NHTSA did not announce we're going to loosen the standards for qualifying. They did announce we're going to do a couple of things to try to speed up essentially speed up the bureaucratic process. And that doesn't that what that does signal is that this administration, I will say, like the previous administration, is supportive of innovation, wants to encourage that, wants to help companies that are interested in putting innovative and yet safe vehicles on the road, and that it's willing to work with them to do that. And it's hard. You don't really have a sample size for how long these things take because there have been so few of these exemptions already granted. But what you could see is an effort to, maybe pour more agency resources into, accelerating that process. The agency has a number of subject matter experts who are familiar with the technology, who certainly speak the language, have the background, and includes people who've been in private industry, and includes people who are really, really interested in this stuff. And the consideration of exemptions is one potential route toward getting more of these relatively innovative, or not relatively, more of these innovative types of vehicles on the road. And I think it is a real question about whether the difficulty, or at least the length of time it could be to get exemptions like this, has been a real roadblock toward innovation. I mean, the autonomous operations really have been quite exploding in the last couple of years. So whether this will accelerate that explosion, I think it is possible, and how much difference it makes on the margins, I think, remains to be seen. I hope that helps answer your question, Harry.
Definitely, but I do want to ask one. I know I lied, but maybe I'm cheating a little bit. But I do want to ask you. We've talked about the United States a lot, right?
Yeah.
Of course, definitely one of the more mature, of course, innovative economies in the world, and autonomous vehicles is no different. But there are at least a couple of countries which are definitely pushing the envelope. I can definitely name at least Germany and China for sure.
Yeah.
And of course, to the extent that you follow these regulations here, how are they, at least in like in layman terms, are they? I'm assuming Europe is more stringent, but it still has a lot of autonomous vehicle companies often launching fast. And then, of course, China, which, of course, is relatively opaque, I assume.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, the EU has issued a pretty elaborate and lengthy autonomous vehicle regulation, and that tries to deal with all kinds of possibilities that problems that vehicles might run into. And the problem with, or rather not the problem, the difference between the EU regulation and something that involves something that you would see in the federal motor vehicle safety standards is that the the way the standard looks is somewhat different, because federal motor vehicle safety standards, they tend to be very objective. They set very specific testing requirements in very mathematical ways. The EU regulation is more, I guess you could say, a little bit impressionistic or subjective. That doesn't mean it's not a carefully
European, huh? Written by some Frenchmen.
A carefully written regulation, but at the same time, it's not something that would necessarily map right on to the like what the U.S. standards, what U.S. law really requires. And so, in terms of stringency, I mean, like I said, there are kind of no real federal U.S. standards. So in that sense, the EU regulation is more stringent just by default. But at the same time, things are just sort of regulated a little bit differently there. And the same can be said for several other countries. And then China, where you're starting to see more autonomous operations, is, as best I can tell, like a bit more of a black box in terms of regulation. What the rules are and how they actually are applied is not something that I have as much knowledge or visibility into. You also have intergovernmental regulations. So, well, the EU obviously is one, but you also, there's a UN body that has been working on autonomous regulations for quite a while. It's called WP29, and it includes representatives from kind of regulators from across the world, like including NHTSA and then NHTSA's counterparts from a number of other countries. And the UN body has been working on developing all kinds of general regulations. Now, none of these would by themselves specifically apply to a particular country, but they're meant to be help sort of establish a broad international agreement on what a framework for
Absolutely.
for autonomous safety regulation should look like.
Absolutely, Adam.
Yeah.
Well, Adam Raviv, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It's amazing, and thank you for this incredible lesson on regulations on autonomous vehicles. And I couldn't have thought of a better person.
Uh, Hari, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate your taking the time to listen. And I really, it's great talking to you, and look forward to talking to you again. So thanks, everyone.